primarily, the reason I'm involved in co-organizing this event with Bashir Saade, who is a lecturer in politics and religion. And I will introduce our other speakers. We have 4 fantastic speakers for very quite short, brief interventions around different aspects of what we're discussing this evening. And we've done that intentionally because we want to try and create as much time for discussion, for debate, for talking as possible. So we're here for this event, Perspectives on Palestine, Past, Present, and Future, to speak, to listen, and to learn about the historical roots and about the international dimensions of the current conflict in Palestine and in Israel. And I think it's not superfluous to remind us of what is at stake when we're talking about those events. More than 50 years of living under occupation, ethnic and religious tensions and oppression, uncountable deaths, the continuing legacy of intergenerational trauma, racism in both the form of Islamophobia and in the form of anti-Semitism. And according to latest figures, and we know that there's debates about these figures, etc., but according to latest figures, currently a child is dying approximately every 15 minutes right now in Gaza. So opening such a space to be able to talk about the roots, the historical roots of these issues, felt important in a context where mutual compassion, spaces of dialogue, the breaking down of walls, both physical and also psychical, has become quite clearly very, very difficult. We organized this panel because we believe that these issues are complex, they're messy, they're difficult to talk about, and it was important to open a space to be able to do that. But we also organized this panel because there are clear historical roots, there are clear messages coming from scholarship, from other areas, that it's important to be able to share and to discuss as well. We have to remember where we're located as well. We're located not only in Scotland, but also the UK. And one of the topics that we'll have an opportunity to explore and discuss is the responsibility of the British state and its historical role as an imperial and colonial power. So we should just bear that in mind as well. When Bashir, who's co-organizing with me, first mentioned the idea of doing this event, I'll admit that I was unprepared for just really the level of resistance, of uncomfortable quietness, and upset that setting up an educational panel would create, whose aim was really just humbly to be able to open a space to talk about particular issues from particular perspectives. And of course, that's resistance, silence, and upset is to some extent normal, a normal part of whenever we're discussing a locus of historical trauma and conflict. And especially where those spark questions around race and racism, religious differences, and the right to exist. But this was not the first time that I was involved in discussions where similar aspects had come about. So I never felt before so questioned over my right to speak, to think, over my ability to manage open conversations without inadvertently saying something that I shouldn't be saying. I'd always been able to talk, but conversations with colleagues I'd always been able to talk to and nearly always agreed with became difficult and fraught at times. And on the lead up to this event, we were subject to trolling on a scale that I had never seen before. Speaking to Bashir early on, and I'm very grateful to him and all the conversations that we've had around organizing this event, I realized this silence for him was a very familiar silence, a silence that he had grown up with and that, he lived with in his everyday life. And then I became confronted with these differences in position in terms of where we come from, a pain of silence that he needed to know, and that up till now I'd had the luxury of being able to ignore. So we organized this panel because it felt impossible not to listen to that silence, not to do something with that silence. A silence that felt like an open wound that needed space to breathe, to be, and to be shared as well. It felt necessary to allow a space where it's possible to say certain things that were not framed in advance in a language of sides in a conflict, and was not afraid to look starkly at the realities of underlying events. So many names from different languages and traditions took up space, became confused, at times bore the pain of intergenerational trauma, but at the same time became part of a web which frustrated the right to be curious, to listen, to try to understand. Nakba, apartheid, occupation, Shoah, terrorism, just to name a few of those words. And amongst this, some words became more prominent than others. Places of enunciation and their meaning were being predetermined. Some people's lives seemed to be mattering more than others. And during all this time, people, and I'm aware that that may include also many people here, were grieving complex losses that could not be straightforwardly reduced to either nationality, ethnic, or religious identities. People who were, in the end, before or else, mother, father, son, sister, brother, and friends. So the idea was to cultivate a space which could be a safe space to be curious, to listen, to understand, to dialogue, but also, of course, to disagree with each other. But also not just a safe space, but a space that should be, and I'm paraphrasing here one of the speakers we have with us tonight, Katherine Bogen, it should be a brave space, a space where we can say those things that are hard to say and hear those things that might be hard to hear and be open to learning from each other. And I want to say as well, I think it's testament to the kind of academic culture we have here at the University of Stirling that admittedly, despite some nervousness around this event, we have been supported, and both of us have felt thoroughly supported throughout to be able to hold this event and to be able to hold this space. So I just kind of formally want to acknowledge that, I suppose. Obviously, to keep that space open, we need to be critical. We need to be sensitive with our use of language. We need to ensure we do not conflate the people of Israel with the state of Israel or the people of Palestine with Hamas. And we must remember in any case that these states and these organizations are heterogeneous and have their own histories. And to say so does not amount to racism or the legitimization of violence. So I ask all of us to bear this in mind as we hold this dialogue, and invite you just to share in the space, to dialogue with us, to immerse yourselves in attempting to understand and think critically about the events that are currently unfolding and the historical situation of Palestine in particular. And so I don't want to take up any more time. I'm going to pass on to our first speaker. And what I will do, because I feel if I present all the speakers now, we'll inevitably forget, I will introduce the speakers and their talk as we go. And I know I've said this already to the speakers, but I will try to be very strict around time to make sure we have that space for dialogue. And just thank you all for being here. Okay, so we'll start with Bashir Saade, an interdisciplinary lecturer in politics and religion at the University of Stirling. His teaching and research interests are multidisciplinary, intersecting between politics, anthropology, philosophy, and social theory. He studies contemporary Islamic politics, as well as pre-modern Arabo-Islamic scholarly traditions. His book, Hezbollah and the Politics of Remembrance from 2016, focused on the cultural and artistic production of the Lebanese political party. He's also a multi-instrumentalist musician, focusing on the Arabic name and part of the Oxford Makam musical group. I'm still intrigued and want to hear you play. I never have done. And the researches and performs traditional Arabic and Ottoman musical styles. And his talk is Zionism and Colonialisms between academic realities and media fictions. Yeah.
Thanks, Pete, for this. This was a very long, detailed description. First, I want to thank Pete for having been there the whole time, for the past, I think, 3 weeks, 1 month, we've been working on this, and we had really interesting conversation about this. So, he was very much of a support. And again, I want to thank the University of Stirling, because I have to say they were very supportive. And as you know, probably a lot of you around the world, it's actually increasingly difficult to be able to hold an event like this or be able to discuss these things. And Stirling was really very very open about it and very, very, very facilitating about it. So that's amazing, and I feel really happy to be based here, really. Okay, so as Pete said, the idea is that we would just talk briefly and that we would open this for discussion. And what I'm going to do is my aim is to be able to make some, if you want philosophical, abstract, if you want points, and about so basically what I would like to talk about is the difference between what we call academic knowledge and other form of knowledge about what's happening in Palestine, Israel, Palestine, or whatever we want to call it, and how a century of scholarship and of the region, from outside the region, and the Western Hemisphere, everywhere, has very, very much and in detail documented, archived, studied, theorized at infinitum what is happening there. In terms of what we call knowledge, there's nothing that has been studied as much as the microphone. Can you hear me? Yeah, sorry. I was just saying that if we look at what academia has produced about Israel, Palestine, about about Zionism, about the Palestinian question, about all of these topics, it is one of the most studied topics. There's probably not one single angle or portion of history or economic, social, political, cultural, whatever analysis you want, that hasn't been put forth and hasn't been studied. And there's how do we say, a unanimous consensus that there are certain things that could be said, and I can state a few things there's no debate around it, from Israeli scholars, from Palestinian scholars, from human scholars, whatever they are on the world, about the issue. And yet, when we look at media, and when we look at public opinion, and when we look at any other form of knowledge that is produced, there's a huge gap between these two. And what I want to talk about today is, why is there a gap? Why until now it's so hard to say something like Israel is a colonial settler state without feeling that it's controversial or there's something wrong? It is not controversial. In the literature, it's not. The people who study this, from anthropologists, political scientists, historians, Israeli, Palestinian, everybody, even Zionists themselves, everybody actually put forth the fact that from the 19th century onward, there is a colonial phenomenon that happened there, that crystallized 1948 and onward has continued expanding. And yet when we look at how the media looks at this issue, the word colonial does not appear in any form. I'm saying mainstream media, of course, not any form of media, but it doesn't feel like in mainstream discourse, the term, for example, colonial can appear. It's controversial. It's a problem. And there's probably reasons for this. And I would like to discuss this with you. And I would love to have your questions about it, or if what you think about it. So the problem of describing what happened in the region at the academic level, there hasn't never been really a problem. There's been debates, of course, and at some point there's a consensus, and it's more or less there. It's very well described. But at the media level, there's this issue. And I think one of the reasons why it's the case is because colonial strategies are in themselves producers of knowledge. They actually shape knowledge. They propose narratives that become dominant. And it's important to study why it's the case and how it happens. And so, for example, if we look at the event of October 7, I'm trying to stick to essentials. If we look at the events of October 7, the main debate around this event is over which either we condemn Hamas of what they did, or we understand Israel's right to defend itself, and the terms of the debates are around either this, or is it possible to have a Palestinian resistance of some sort. So these are the kinds of, so people are either on one side or the other. But at the end of the day, there's, in a sense, there's some kind of a historical perspective in looking at what happened. It's all about either condemnation or labeling or stigmatizing a group or another, whether Israel or Palestine. So either saying Israel is being murderous and doing a killing rampage in Gaza, and you can describe it as such, or you say, okay, Hamas is a terrorist organization and they're doing this and this and that. The main issue is with labeling, so that in order to create some kind of legitimating action for the other party's event. But rarely do we see an actual move beyond this labeling and understanding why is Hamas here in the first place? Why is Israel acting like this in the first place? How did Israel act for decades? How did Hamas act before? How did it come about? What was there before Hamas? So this kind of historical perspective is most often lost in the debate. So I tried to look at a bit of how mainstream media looks at this. And I went to the BBC website, which, as many of you know, has been very much criticized for its coverage of the conflict. And I looked at the history, the history page of the BBC. There's a kind of history of the Arab-Israeli, they call it Arab-Israeli conflict or Israel-Palestine conflict, which obviously is also a controversial term. And on the website, they say, and I quote, I can find it. Where is it? My eyes are not working anymore. Okay, I can't find it. It says that, before 1948, so at the eve of 1948, it says Jewish populations were claiming, the Jewish populations wanted their ancestral home, and Arabs also had a claim to the land. And I found this formula very, very strange. Like, what does it tell us exactly? There's something strange. Of course, the BBC and the whole media system of the UK is sitting in a country where the best universities exist, the most amazing academic departments, and the most amount of research has been created here. They could just tap into any resource of any author that exists in the whole of the UK. So much funding goes to study this region. Saying something like this sounds like out of complete ignorance. How can something like this exist? So that discrepancy, I think, is part of the colonial logic. It's part of there's an intent of actually trying to describe things in a certain way, because that's the kind of knowledge we want to push forth. This is the knowledge that actually makes sense. So it's no wonder that the person that criticized Orientalism, or the person that actually came about to say, there's a problem between how you produce knowledge and the colonial, if you want, infrastructure in which knowledge is produced, was a Palestinian scholar, because obviously he had this experience. And one of the things that probably Palestinians, and more extensively, maybe more broadly Arabs that have been in the region, can tell is that one of the biggest shock, and why this conflict, or this phenomenon, so as not to call it conflict, has stirred so much frustration, is to look at how, even though it's so clear what's happening, it has always been described as something else. And so there's something wrong. The way it's described just is either manipulated, or there's some kind of apathy over how this knowledge is produced. So that's the first point I want to make. The second point I want to make that we could also talk about is that I feel that with what's happening today and what has been happening for a few decades in the region, one of the issues that makes this so hot, such a hot topic and such a debated and so polemic, is the fact that it's Western civilization and by extension, world civilization, modern civilization, that is at stake. It's really there because of that discrepancy between academic knowledge and the knowledge that is actually being always manipulated. There's a problem with which all of these ideals that have been erected by Western civilization in the 19th century and onwards are being basically are falling apart, are being completely disrespected. They're being shown that they have a hypocritical nature. I mean, in what happened in Gaza, regardless of what we think October 7 was and how whatever happened, even if Hamas are hiding in hospitals, and even if they're doing all of that stuff, there is not one single law that hasn't been violated by Israel in its attack on Gaza. International law, international war, the war conventions have, there's so many laws that have been violated, and human rights, concepts of sovereignty, even democracy, all of these concepts that we learn in academia, these are the things that politics students, I don't know if you have anyone studying politics here, these are the first things that we study. They're all being flaunted, they're all being completely put to rest. I've just heard from colleagues in Lebanon that international relations, international law professors in universities have decided not to teach the subject anymore because they think it's obsolete. That there's some kind of a boycott of, because it does makes you think, like, why, how come we've been teaching this for so long and it has absolutely no bearing on when it's there and we need it, it just doesn't function. So again, this problem of knowledge discrepancy that I think is really important. Now, I wanna just close with saying, I think this problem, and from something I'm interested in my studies, I'm interested in the relationship between knowledge and emotions, and I want to say that I think this problem of knowledge discrepancy has to do with the emotional laden, if you want, structure that brings that knowledge out. And of course, the issue of the Jewish question in that in the 19th century and later on after the Second World War, and the idea that the Jews have the right to have some kind of political protection somewhere, and especially in this case in Palestine. And on the other side, the idea that people have the right to have sovereignty or have the right to self-determination, i.e. either Jewish immigrants in Palestine, but also Palestinian Palestinians, basically. I think because there's an emotional thing here going on, there's a problem in how we produce this knowledge. And I think the main issue with this argument is that emotions, so my point here is to say that these emotions are not stalling knowledge, they're just producing another form of knowledge. So if we think about it, when we say, Hamas did this because they're trying to get their land back, or they're upset because Gaza is an open air prison, and then the answer is, yeah, but Israel has the right to defend itself, and anyway, how will Jews feel, in Israel, or Israelis feel that they're safe, or something like this? So they have to retaliate, and vice versa. The problem in this is that every time we move from one argument to the other, because of this emotional component, what happens is that there's a dehumanization of one of the parties, in this case the Palestinians, because the source of the problem in Palestine is the idea that one group of people needs to be protected, or needs to have some kind of a project that is protected. And I think the only way for this to be resolved is to think, if this is a colonial situation, then what needs to happen is that there should be a dismantling of this project. And I think most of these slogans that we hear, the slogans that we hear that are controversial, like from the land to the sea, or that Palestine should, we should dismantle the apartheid state and all this, means exactly that. It means restore that the real knowledge of what happened. We need to dismantle the colonial structure, regardless who lives there. And we need to live in a situation where there is coexistence, dignity, etc., for everybody there. So yeah, so I'm gonna just stop there, and yeah, let Peter take over. Did I stick to time? No.
Thank you, Bashir. Thank you for that. So we'll just open up to 5 minutes of questions, and I think it might be good to collect maybe 2 or 3, and for you to respond then all at once. Questions from the floor.
You have to enable the mic.
Yeah, Ali. So I'm going to enable your mic and your camera so that you can speak.
Hi.
You should.
Can you hear me?
Hi. Yes, we can hear you fine. Ali, please go ahead with your
Alright.
question.
Thank you so much for having us today. At the end, you mentioned we should live in coexistence, and I was wondering, what do you actually mean by that?
Thanks, Ali. That's great. I'm going to disable your mic again, disable your camera, but thanks for the question. Any further questions? Yeah, okay. So we have possibly 3 questions.
Hi, thank you for your talk. It was very interesting. I was just wondering about something that's also baffled me between this kind of, as you say, this kind of gap between academic knowledge and what has been factually solidified academically, and then the gap between the mainstream narratives, and just kind of how profoundly exhausting that is to have to trudge through this kind of like sewage of knowledge that has no credibility and no kind of substantial basis. And I was just wondering, in terms of kind of the political level, which is something potentially in between the academic and the mainstream, to what extent do you think kind of the politicians at the forefront in kind of Western democracies are actually deeply knowledgeable about this region and purposefully misinforming the narratives and manipulating the narratives, and to what extent many of them are just kind of idiots who don't know what they're talking about? Yeah.
Thank you. There was somebody up here, I think.
Yeah, hi. Again, thank you for the talk. It was fantastic. I think another, because you kind of spoke about very briefly the concept of you know, international law, these basic tenets being defied by Israel's actions, but it does make one wonder, given the history of Israel, we tend to think of the kind of components of like democracy and self-determination and then their crimes as contradictory in the level of obfuscation, but does it not kind of reveal in this very specific way that the manner by which we've been conditioned to think of democracy includes this inherent exception in the colonized subjects, in the colonial form, and that can kind of be, broadly speaking, also applied to internal populations, minorities or otherwise, whereby this sacred right of democracy is ultimately nothing more than just a kind of power structure.
There's someone at the back. Okay, just very quickly for Ali online, how do we see coexistence? I to be honest, I think if you listen to someone like Ilan Pappé, the Israeli historian, to whom I would have complete reverence over the subject. We have to listen to people who are from there. I think either Palestinians or Israelis, but Israelis working for peace, I would say, and of course Palestinians working for that. But I think basically, there's two narratives there's two solutions. They say one is the two-state solution, and the other one is just one-state solution. And by one state, of course, it doesn't mean that one population gets kicked out, but that there's some kind of pluralist state. And I think a lot of people are working on trying to rethink how this region has always been a very diverse and very pluralist region. And what has created this narrative has been nationalism, kind of chauvinistic, rigidly defined forms of nationalism, of which Zionism is one. So first, one of the things is to be able to address seriously, without being scared, that there's a problem with Zionism, and it shouldn't be something that scares a population or a group of people that in a sense. So I think there's the idea of coexistence obviously is a huge ideal given the situation now, given the war raging now. But it's really in times of war that this kind of clarity comes sometimes horribly enough. And yeah, I mean, I think this is what I mean by coexistence. Your question, I think I kind of forgot what was the question. You remember? Oh yeah, that's a tricky question. I think, of course, some people know. Of course, some people are sticking to a script. Just to be very essentialist, very quick. I think most of mainstream discourse is sticking to a script. There's, it's just some of them don't know. They're not concerned. Why would they? I mean, it's a region far away, and so I think they're sticking to a script. They don't know. There's also, they don't know. This is a discrepancy between academic knowledge, which obviously, as you know, as students, not many people read, and then there's, and then there's the stuff that's going on the internet. But actually, interestingly enough, because of alternative media now, and because of Twitter and things like this, we have an unprecedented overflow of knowledge. Obviously, some of it is just you have to sift through things, but you have access to information that you never had before. And you see, I mean, from my perspective, somebody who's not too old, but kind of older than some, I can see that you can see the difference. You can see a trend. I remember in the 90s when I was a student, end of 90s. Okay. I know I'm only joking. So you can see that at the time, the idea of getting to information was so hard. You had to go to the library. You had to get a book. You had to know what's going on, and for very simple things. Now you have just Wikipedia has so much stuff. Of course, a lot of it is bogus, but it's also some of it is really enlightening. So, yeah. So I mean, and looking at the war now on Twitter, you really have a live, hour per hour, minute per minute. Unfolding what's going on. A theory comes out of the Israeli army, 2 seconds later it's debunked, and you can see what's the propaganda about it. It's just crazy. It's all there to see for those who want. This is the thing. So yeah, I didn't understand your question. I think you were more making a statement.
Perhaps what Israel represents to a lot of foreign as this kind of enclave of in the Middle East, which designates does it not, to an extent, reveal the fact that democracy extent to make the exception and the necessity to make the exception?
Yeah. Well, I mean, okay, great. The actual human rights organization, international organizations, all of these organizations are very much condemning what Israel is doing. There's countless UN resolution, countless Human Rights Watch reports of violations of all sorts of basic stuff. But there's definitely a policy in the West to consider Israel as an exception, as something that we need to just let it happen, just maybe they'll fix things. It is messy, but we went too far. So we just have to let things go, because obviously there's an existential angst, behind it. Okay, so.
Thank you, Bashir. I know there are more questions. Let's sit on those questions. In the interest of time, we're going to move on to our next speaker. And this will be, I think, very connected. So a lot of those questions that might be there might be still relevant for Hajar. So I'm introducing Hajar Ibrahim, who is president of the Edinburgh University Justice for Palestine Society and a law and international relations student at the University of Edinburgh. Hajar's organised many protests and actions over the past month and indeed years. She just launched the divestment campaign against the University of Edinburgh for investing £39 million in Israel. Growing up in Lebanon, Hajar taught Palestinian refugees at Beit Atfal Asumud School in Burj al-Barajneh camp. And she's particularly interested in intersections between humanitarianism, law, and violence, especially in the Gaza Strip. This is her own bio. I would say it's a very modest one. She's very accomplished, and we're very, very, very excited to have you here, Hajar. So thank you very much for coming and speaking. And her title is Trapped in the Terrorism Narrative, the Suppression of the Palestinian Plight.
Thank you for having me here. I think I'll just get straight into it and hopefully answer your question, build on the answer to the question, and yeah, leave the floor open to more questions. So let's begin with saying the entire concept of terrorism is completely political and always has been. It's part of the modern Western securitization strategy and a prime way to enact measures of suppression, detainment, deportation. Plus, there's no internationally agreed judicial guideline over what exactly it means. And as we see now, terrorism could be journalists and their families in Gaza. It can be academics. It can be hospitals, doctors, entire hospitals. Or, as we saw yesterday, the days of the week in Arabic. So in order for Israel to continue its forward advance in the disputed Palestinian territories and claim more land and kill more Palestinians without angering the US or the international community, it would have to successfully construct an image that equated Palestinians, all of them, with terrorists. The life of the Palestinian would thus appear less valuable than the life of an Israeli. Under the British mandate, and after the Balfour Declaration of 1917, which actually Arthur Balfour was the Chancellor of the University of Edinburgh during that time, and for 30 years, Palestinians were conceived of as a backward, oriental, inert mass. The Balfour Declaration institutionalized erasure and transformed British colonial prerogative into international law and policy. The law had rendered us non-existent. Palestinians do not own the words of power. We are prescribed as violent and as bigoted. We are the ones susceptible to labels and to descriptions, and the manufacturing of a Muslim otherness was fundamental to this exclusion. The uncivilized native soon became replaced by the fanatical Muslim. And it is, of course, easier to vilify and thus control a population whose resistance is cast as stemming from their essentialized nature, as opposed to a joint interreligious or secular Arab solidarity against occupation and oppression. How Palestinians viewed themselves, of course, that doesn't matter. And thus, we engender a framework where violence takes on different meanings and triggers different responses depending on the actor deploying it. So we have the unacceptable anti-colonial violence on one end and the acceptable state colonial violence on the other end, which then purifies itself by appealing to its own ideality. Irrespective, of course, of the religious identity of the heterogeneous population of Palestinians and the Middle East, Palestinians are labeled as Islamist terrorists. The narrativization of Islam can be understood as part of the West construction of a myth of religious violence that in turn helps conceal or legitimate the violence carried out in the name of the secular state, in this case, Israel. So I'll briefly discuss the paradox of sovereignty and that it precludes that the state violence of Israel, which by all definitions has already expressed genocidal intent, the hardest thing to prove about a genocide, they've admitted to themselves. But the paradox of sovereignty allows for these crimes to be committed in the name of self-defense. This is a very common Zionist myth that, and propaganda that is especially relevant for the Gaza Strip. So as some of you might know, in 2005, Israel announced its unilateral disengagement from the Gaza Strip, abrogating its legal obligations as the belligerent occupier. And in 2007, Hamas was elected, and thus Gaza was categorized as a hostile territory. This categorization bears no legal significance in international humanitarian law, doesn't shift Israel's international obligation as the occupying power. Also, the International Court of Justice held that the transfer of powers by Israel and agreements with the PLO does not end Israel's status as the occupying power. The occupying power remains the occupier until the occupier is dispossessed, basically. Yet, Israel used this designation, hostile territory, to stop importing electricity, fuel, and other supplies, restricting imports only to humanitarian supplies. In the absence of an agreed legal definition, Israel's disengagement manages to circumvent the legal binaries of occupation. So disengagement, coupled with one of the most brutal sieges in modern history, operating from the air, sea, and margins of territory instead of from the ground, generates an apparatus of social control which current vocabulary is ill-equipped to define. Whether or not Israel disengages from the Gaza Strip, it remains occupied territory. The fact that occupation requires occupying forces on land is based on traditional and outdated concepts of warfare. The humanitarian siege, as they call it, unlike a conventional siege, is an indefinite one. The green line, the electronic fences, the barriers, the impenetrable border is an offensive technology applied by Israel. In a conventional siege, a city's fortification is its own defensive technology. Symbolically, Israel's disengagement meant the green line, an extensively contentious border, should be understood as an international border. However, it is not. It's rigid from the Palestinian side and porous from the Israeli side. And so when Gaza is categorized as a hostile territory, Israel's violence is classified as self-defense. Where law engenders violence, only the state will have legitimate recourse to it. Where humanity is juridical, Gazans have no recourse to life but humanitarian assistance. In fact, the anti-colonial account defines human rights as rights made possible through political membership, achieved through self-determination. And therefore, the fight for self-determination is a prerequisite for human rights. Also, to just elaborate a bit on the nature of the positivist law process, which only confers rights and duties to those who ascribe to the positivist law, state practice continuously develops international law through its application of violence in the name of humanity. A professor of ethics at Tel Aviv University, Asa Kasher, put it explicitly: what we do becomes the law. He describes a historical process whereby state-sanctioned violence becomes the precedent for legislating the laws of war. Furthermore, ambiguity serves to circumvent Israel from precise legal obligations. Gaza represents a zone of ambiguity, a legal black hole, and humanitarian government interacts in this matrix in formalizing impunity due to a possible legality. And so the humanitarian minimum is consistently adjusted to legitimize the violence and pain Gazans are meant to experience. Unfortunately, the national struggle finds itself voicing local demands in the international sphere. The same international sphere which also legitimized the siege for being humanitarian. And what is clear is that there is a contradiction. There is failure, there is violence and domination inherent to the legal and humanitarian framework. In fact, contemporary international lawyer Noura Arakat explains, international law is a derivative of a colonial order and positioned as universal in appeal and application, but is the codification of exclusively European traditions. Again, reinforcing an acceptable formulation of power and authority. The only acceptable formulation of power is the nation state. And so under the self-referential positive law, the weight of the past is lifted, allowing the law, together with the present to which it belongs, to cyclically constitute its own grounds of citability and legitimation, meaning there's no exterior to check it, there's no limits on its expansion, and no memory to stop this expansion. The violence of the law's coloniality, ever obfuscated by its self-referentiality, emerges from its self-alleged production of humanity. Its humanizing project necessarily implies the dehumanization in its absence. And of course, historical evidence overwhelmingly supports that self-determination is rarely achieved without the use of force and armed struggle. Failing to acknowledge resistance movements would lead to an illogical situation. Alien occupations would go unchallenged, rendering any resistance against their illegal status illegal itself. But Palestinian political violence is not an end in itself. It's a means to an end. Armed resistance is not a pathological, irrational, or religious given, but a response to a political problem: oppression, occupation, and siege, when alternative means to political advancement have been curtailed. And although we've tried to pursue a peace path, a two-state solution, for example, 30 years later, after the Oslo Peace Accords, the amount of settlers in the illegal settlers in the West Bank has increased by more than an eightfold. The Palestinian Authority is totally stripped of any powers. Palestinians do not control their borders, their economy, their people, their resources. They cannot build, construct, or develop without an Israeli permit. Resistance for us is also more ambivalent, spiritual, and elusive than one can hope to reflect accurately. It's deeply rooted in the metaphysical world, and it is driven by abstract conceptualizations of freedom, justice, and self-determination. In Noura Arakat's words, we have ceased to refer to the desired nation state alone, and it has come to encompass a more abstract demand for freedom. It is a call that implicates an attachment to the land as a means of memory, existence, and dignity. But I'll end here, but I'll leave maybe the audience with two questions. What does the idealized right to self-determination even mean if it can be appropriated by a predominantly European settler community who covets that right for itself? And how emancipatory is this liberal ideal if it can be used in a century's worth of Zionist propaganda, casting Israel as a decolonized state? Thank you. And
thank you, Hajar. Thank you very much, Hajar. It was great to see the resonances there as well with what we were debating before. So as before, we will open up for 2 or 3 questions. We have one online, but I'd like to see here as well if there are any questions on here. To the left, yeah, thank you. Okay, so we have 3 questions. I think we'll take all 4 questions. I think I'll just ask the if possible to keep the questions brief. So starting here again.
If you insist. I've got to make this good now, yeah. Thank you very much, Hajar. That was absolutely fantastic. I was just while you were speaking, there was a lot of sort of similarities. Obviously, I'm Irish, and I've looked a lot at the Irish struggle for national liberation, and it seems like there's a lot of parallels in terms of first it's labelled as terrorism, and then it's recognised the struggle for national liberation, and eventually 100 years into the future, the liberals of Ireland are very accepting that the Irish War of Independence, the Easter Rising, were very good things. Is there anything at all that makes the Palestinian resistance and the Palestinian struggle for national liberation different to any other settler colony which has had to take up arms and fight for national liberation in order to gain that little bit of self-determination?
Okay, I'll pass around. That's all right. Come back. Yeah, sure. I have to go around anyway.
Thank you for that question. Palestinian resistance has also never viewed itself in a vacuum. Unfortunately, we're past the wave now of the anti-colonial liberation struggles that swept the world in the 70s. And so we're here making these confrontations on the world stage, isolated, but with the support of previous colonized people. There is really nothing different. We've seen over and over again that armed resistance, which is a right and a duty codified in international law, is labeled as terrorism. The interesting thing about Zionism as a settler colony in comparison to other settler colonies is that they claim to have come home. So there's this like. That needs a lot of detangling, yeah, but in general, armed resistance worldwide for all colonized people is a unified movement. The liberation of Palestinians would put into the question the situation of all currently oppressed people and their liberation struggles as well. This is why it creates a lot of fear in Western democracies, as well as Arab governments.
2 questions, I think.
Thank you so much. That was an absolutely amazing speech. I've got a very personal question. So I work in solidarity with the Kurdistan Freedom Movement. And for me, it's been sometimes difficult to speak about Palestine from a very supportive place. Like, I fully agree with everything you've said. In the terms of not agreeing with certain parts, for example, marching next to someone who's wrapped in a Turkey flag. Turkey is a state that attacks Kurdish people on all levels. And how do you speak about the controversies in a way that you put first that, of course, Palestinians have the right to self-defense and the attacks are absolutely unacceptable. And yet there are things in the name of resistance or in the name or allies that are being made that I personally don't agree with and many people don't agree with. How do you have those difficult conversations? And particularly coming from the context of working with Kurdish people, there's Palestinian settlements, illegal Palestinian settlements in Afrin, which is part of Rojava, Western Kurdistan. So yeah, how do you deal with the controversies in communication without losing the line, Palestine should be free?
I think this is just, I think it's for everybody. Thank you for everybody. But I guess for me, I mean, I don't know. I don't know what's wrong with you if you can watch what's going on in Palestine right now and not call it a genocide and not see it for what it is. But my concern, what I'm curious is going forward, when we're out, hopefully soon, of this crisis moment, what do we do, particularly those of us in the West, to best support the future of a free Palestine that doesn't see this hideous pattern just keep recurring and recurring? So I just would really like if all of the speakers have had the opportunity at some chance to speak to that. Thank you.
Down here.
Thank you for your question. I think with Palestinian self-determination, it's been very much usurped by pan-Arabist and Arab nationalism and those movements, which would then directly contradict the question of Kurdish self-determination. And so you have the two peoples kind of pinned against each other, one being Palestinian Arab, the other being Kurdish. But there's so many similarities at the end of the day that we should not fall into this rhetoric that's being pushed forward by Arab governments, etc. For example, the PKK is also considered a terrorist organization, like Hamas. The question of illegal settlements in Irfin, yes, this has been happening where the relocation of Palestinian refugees across the Middle East is then considered like a state within a state. Lebanon is also a prime example where, but this wouldn't necessarily be a question for Palestinians to respond to, because again, it's been usurped by Erdogan or other governments. the question of protests and seeing the Turkish flag and stuff. At the end of the day, also the question of Palestine is all encompassing, and different people relate to it from different angles, and so we can't really create a singular people with a unified reason for why they support the Palestinian question. You have the like I said, national liberation movements and resistance globally. You have Muslims who support it as a Muslim cause for the Ummah, and such and such. And it's very pluralistic. The people that represent the cause for Palestine. But at the end of the day, like I said, the freedom of one is the freedom for all. So yeah. And with your question, can you remind me? Okay. I think there's so many possible answers to this, but I'll use the words of Ghassan Abu Sitta, a surgeon in Gaza right now. He keeps stressing that what we have to think of once there is a ceasefire is, what will we do the day after? Too many times, the reason the cycle of violence continues is because they bomb us indiscriminately, genocide, and then they have us begging to return to the status quo, which was already an unlivable situation. So we have to make sure that when we ask for a ceasefire, we're also demanding for all the steps that should follow it. Not just a pause in the most extreme manifestations of violence on the Gaza Strip. So yeah, to think of the day after, and to not forget the question of Palestine until an Israeli is killed. Like that, already before October 7, 2023 was the deadliest year for Palestinians. But the question really only came to the forefront of people's minds after October 7. So yeah, to just not stop at a ceasefire would be the answer to that. Yeah.
Thank you, Hajar. Do you want to add something, Bashir?
Just a quick add to what you're saying, and I think we're gonna maybe go back to this. What comes after? What are solutions and stuff? And I mentioned something. I mentioned before some of the ideals or the vision, but the idea is there should be a political, comprehensive effort to solve. To take this seriously, not to just pause and then wait for and just let Israel continue doing what it's doing, and then yes, as Hajar said, there's a problem, there's an event that happens that shocks everybody, then Israel retaliates again. So the idea is to have some kind of working framework where there's just peace that can unfold. Yeah.
Thank you. I think in the interest of time, we'll hold on to those questions. I know there's some online as well. Thank you, Hajar. That was very powerful. Go with you. Yeah. Okay. So next up, we have our own Claire Squires. Professor Claire Squires is Professor of Publishing Studies at the University of Stirling, and Director of the Scottish Graduate School for Arts and Humanities. And I just want to say that I'm very grateful, because I know you're sandwiched between lots of different things just to be able to be here, and we're grateful for that. Her publications include, with Beth Driscoll, the Frankfurt Kabuff Critical Edition from 2023, and the Frankfurt Book Fair and Bestseller Business from 2020. She's also co-volume editor of the Cambridge History of the Book in Britain, Volume 7, the 20th Century and Beyond. And today she's going to talk to us, and there's a presentation slide here, so I'm going to actually share this slide with the online audience as well. And her talk is the Frankfurt Book Fair and Adania, Shibli's A Minor Detail. Thank you, Claire.
Thanks so much for that introduction, Pete, and to you and Bashir for pulling this event together. I know it's not been easy, but you've just already created a wonderful space for us to have conversations. So thanks so much for that. I'm also going to apologise. The organisers know this. I'm going to have to run quite soon after I speak. So my apologies for that, because I really wanted to stay. But as Pete says, I'm sandwiched. I also wanted to start off by saying that Palestine is far from my area of knowledge, although I hope what I'm going to say in the next few minutes will make it evident how I'm bringing my academic expertise to bear on the topic. I think that said, the situation in Gaza has gone far beyond one in which only experts should be able to express opinions, and I think it's really incumbent on all of us to feel able to speak out. Indeed, there's very much evidence in our sector, higher education, that academic freedoms are being curtailed in the UK by the UK Secretary of State for Science, Innovation and Technology in her confected war on woke, and recent attack on Research England's new Equalities, Diversity and Inclusion Advisory Group, an attack which particularly focused on colleagues' social media responses to the situation in Palestine. So freedom of speech issues are central to the topic that I'm going to talk about today, and do bring in my expertise that Pete's already mentioned with regards to the Frankfurt Book Fair and literary prize giving, which might seem a little bit far away, but I'm sure some of you will know some of the context to this. So I'm drawing on a short piece my research partner Beth Driscoll and I wrote that was published in The Conversation a couple of weeks ago. So if you want to kind of read up on a little bit further, there's information there. I won't take the time to talk about it just now, but actually the process of getting it published in terms of the media was kind of interesting in itself, and I can happily talk about that a little bit later. So the Frankfurt Book Fair and the Book Messe is the world's largest publishing industry event. It attracts thousands of exhibitors every October. On one level, it's a business event focused on creating buzz for forthcoming bestsellers, trading rights, and discussing industry developments. On another, it's a public celebration of books and the values associated with them. However, in this, its 75th year, Frankfurt's normal business was disrupted by a suggestion that a particular book should not be celebrated. That book is Minor Detail by Palestinian author Adania Shibli, which presents a fictionalized account of the real-life rape and murder of a Palestinian Bedouin girl by Israeli soldiers in 1949, and a subsequent narrative in the second part of the novella, with a character in Gaza trying to discover what had happened to this girl. Shibli was the winner of the 2023 Literature Prize, awarded by the German Literary Association Litprom to a female author from the Global South. However, the prize ceremony, due to take place at the Book Messe, was cancelled. Litprom grounded its decision in the context of Hamas's attacks of the 7th of October. So, as they said, due to the war started by Hamas, under which millions of people in Israel and Palestine are suffering, the organizer Litprom decided not to hold the award ceremony. It's looking for a suitable format and setting for the event at a later point. As far as I'm aware, others of you may know a bit more. I'm not sure this has happened subsequently. This screenshot from their website, I think, was also updated as well in that kind of second part of the text that you can see right there. I don't think from memory, I didn't take a screenshot at the time, that's what it originally said when it announced the cancellation or postponement of the ceremony. The Frankfurt Book Fair took great pains to kind of distance itself from this cancellation or postponement. It was really interesting, instructive to see the Book Messe's responses on social media to anybody who decried the cancellation. So it was almost like they were trolling everybody by saying, it's not us that's cancelled it, it's Litprom, they're a separate organization. Everybody that they found who was talking about it, they responded in this way. However, Litprom is part funded by the Book Messe, and the president of the board of Litprom is Jürgen Buß, who's director of the Book Messe. So there's quite a lot of implication there. And the statement that you can see here is from Instagram, a slightly odd way to make political statements, I think, where immediately after the 7th of October, Booth, the director of the book fair, released a statement expressing the fair's desire to, I quote, make Jewish and Israeli voices especially visible at the book fair. Frankfurt Book Messe stands in complete solidarity on the side of Israel. And there's obviously a lot more to explore in terms of German positioning, in particular, obviously, with regards to both this particular instance, but also more generally in terms of protest and cut down on protest. So what happened next? The New York Times reported that Shibli had agreed to the postponement and to the cancellation of a talk between her and her German translator. This simply wasn't true. And Shibli's publishers and literary agent expressed their anger at the cancellation and also what was a barefaced lie, actually. Numerous authors, publishers, national agencies and organizations subsequently pulled out of the fair, including the Arab Publishers Association, the Emirates Publishing Association, the Indonesian Publishers Association, and Publish Her, which is a group of female publishing leaders. The cancellation was also condemned by PEN International, the global organization for defending writers' freedom of expression, and an open letter was signed by more than 1,500 writers, publishers, and academics. So a commercial book fair might not seem an immediate place, an obvious place of position taking, but the book fair has very political roots. The foundations of the modern fair were laid after the Second World War, amid a desire for global harmony. Its original setting was the Paulskirche, a historically important site for German democracy. It was the location of the first unified German parliament in 1848 and the first building reconstructed after the heavy wartime bombing of Frankfurt. From 1950, the German Publishers and Booksellers Association's Peace Prize has been awarded during the fair. The prize aims to show the trade's, I quote, commitment to serving international understanding between nations and cultures. It's one tool, therefore, in the fair's self-construction as a site not only of international commerce, but also of cosmopolitan discourse. This year, the prize went to Salman Rushdie. But the fair's idealistic self-constructions have often been at odds with its actions. In 1968, a year of global protests and unrest, there was a heavy police presence at the book fair, which was dubbed the Polizeimesse, the police fair, as a consequence. Tensions in that year centered on the award of the Peace Prize to the Senegalese president and poet Leopold Sédar Senghor. The award indicated a West German opening up to Africa and former European colonies. However, Senghor had violently suppressed student revolts at Dakar University earlier in the year against what students viewed as a neo-colonial and anti-democratic regime. In turn, and this is a screenshot from a great video, Pathé video, German students protested in solidarity with their Dakar peers. While Senghor received the prize, it's the protests that are remembered. More recently, the bestowal of the fair's guest of honor status to oppressive political states, including Turkey and China in 2008 and 2009 respectively, have proved, as you might imagine, contentious. The fair's aspiration to separate culture from regime and to encourage democracy through the means of culture has been frequently challenged as a consequence. Just before lockdown, for a couple of years actually, my research partner and I conducted fieldwork at Frankfurt. During this period, there was the resurgence, obviously, of far-right politics across the world, which presented more challenges to the fair's neutrality. The first year that we were conducting fieldwork in 2017, fights broke out at the stand of a far-right publisher, which was allowed to exhibit at the fair. one of a series of disturbances which was kind of brought about by its presence. We were actually in the hall at the time. We didn't see it, but we could hear it happening and people running away and security running towards. The fair's free speech stance was heavily debated as a consequence, and its aisles patrolled once more again by armed police. Since last year as well, the fair has had something it calls the awareness team, which is who you're supposed to report to any discrimination that you might see happening. So our own research led us to tackle this, what we saw of as real kind of political zigzagging and contradictory stances. In a rather unusual research output, we self-published a thriller called The Frankfurt Kabuff, which is what you can see on the screen, in which the baddies are a neo-Nazi organization, White Storm, attempting to take over Frankfurt, and, sorry, bit of a plot spoiler, a vice president for intellectual freedom in a very compromised position. Our novella interrogates the shadowy, unresolved political impulses of the publishing industry, and I would say kind of the creative economy with regards to these issues more generally. In turn, the case of the cancellation of the awards ceremony for Shibli's Minor Detail cast the light on the very mixed messages about the humanitarian obligations of books, authors, and publishing professionals, and I'd argue the West more generally. So I'm just going to conclude with this article, which some of you may already have read, but if not, I'd urge you to do it. It appeared last week in The Guardian, and I think, as far as I'm aware, certainly in the English language anyway, there may well have been other things elsewhere, and if people know, I'd be really pleased to hear it. Some words from an interview with Shibli. I'll read it out just in case anyone can't read it from the screen. So this is the journalist talking first. Since the explosion of violence in Israel and Palestine, words have left her, Shibli, almost entirely, and she worries over their departure. Shibli says, "I was always afraid one day that I would wake up and I wouldn't have language. This is my fear. And in the last 4 weeks, language has deserted me. It was like it was not there. Whenever I tried, I failed. I now understand this loss of language as an outcome of staying with pain, the incomprehensible pain of those in Palestine, Israel, against whom a new degree of cruelty has been unleashed, the personal pain of the loss of a dream that we could dare to imagine a new form of togetherness where we allow ourselves to learn from pain rather than unleash it on others." Thank you very much.
Thank you for that, Claire. And I was just really struck there by some of the parallels talking about the 1970s and today that comes up very clearly there as well. So as before, I'll stop sharing the PowerPoint slides for those online, and we'll open up to questions. I know we have one online from Angelica who didn't get to speak before, so I will make sure that Angelica gets a chance for a question. But before that, just to see, and I wonder if I can abuse actually my privilege as well as holding the mic and ask you to invite you to talk a little bit about that experience of publishing on this topic in the conversation, the experience of that. And I'll unmute you, Angelica, and allow the camera. So you should be able to ask your question.
I see unmute and the movie, accept.
Hi, Angelica. Can you hear us?
Hi there. Yes. Thank you, everybody. And first of all, I'm from Stockholm, Sweden. And I just want to start to say, and I'm deep, and many people with me sorrow deeply in almost a psychotic sorrowness for the situation for the people in Palestine. One are sleepless, but this weekend we are more worried about the Palestinian. But now to my question. I feel, I don't think just is a feeling, is there other war going on here with framing the situation. And just to give one example, this morning in the Swedish television, they said they show at the Shifa hospital picture from there with babies and people running, and they said here is a picture from the terrorist stamped Hamas, the picture from, and I said to myself, what on earth? In one sense, they say two things. They show the picture inside the Shifa hospital, but they said that the picture was coming from the Hamas. And I felt normally in every other news, they are very much severe to present the fact, the source of the picture. And then they just say it easily. And this is just one example, because I feel here with, and especially not in another conflict, with Israel-Palestina question, when it comes to this question, is a kind of partner, secondary and primary partner in the war, where I feel our media in the West, they are a partner in crime with Israel. But they do it so slicely, they do it so beautiful, so it's very much difficult for the normal media consumer to discover. And there I need help from you to explain it, how to tackle, how to, excuse me, my English, how to struggle this problem, because I think the Palestinian people, this war, a big part of this is we people on the whole world who is on the floor, who can help, who can push stress on our political person in the media. We need your help. How shall we work to help the Palestinians?
Fantastic. Thank you for your question, Angelica. Your English was perfectly understandable, and we're so pleased you could join us from Stockholm. So thank you. I'm going to disable the mic and disable the camera again. And yeah, and I'll pass on to you, Claire.
Yeah. Yeah, in response to Angelica's comments about framing, and then I can, tell you a bit more about this experience of being published in the conversation. I mean, I think what Angelica was talking about kind of fed into, Bashir, what you mentioned in terms of the BBC's constructions of, particular words, language to describe, what's been going on. And it kind of put me in mind of, because I went to a talk relatively recently that Bridget Fowler, the retired professor of sociology from Glasgow, gave, talking about constructions of the miners' strike in Britain, and how the BBC, the kind of language that was used there, and how that then translated into the thought processes decades later, actually, in terms of the ways in which the various kind of forms of activity were happening at that point, kind of painstaking, particularly at that time, sort of work coding news reports on the miners' strike, where violence was coming from, who was at fault, etc., etc. And it really kind of made me, think about, these questions about academic knowledge and the ways in which we can interrogate how discourse is constructed. I think that's so important. The story about getting published in the conversation. So as many of you will know, the conversation is a place where academics write for a more popular audience, very short pieces, 800 words normally. You get a scoring, whether you're writing for high school or undergraduate or postgraduate students or something. You're supposed to aim for high school students to communicate as well as possible. So my research partner and I pitched the piece that kind of what I was talking about today came from, and it was in a way that I'd never been interrogated on before. I was asked, what my knowledge base was, and I was like, 2 peer-reviewed university press books on the Frankfurt Book Fair, yes. But also it was quite interesting. I'd never had this, and I actually kind of wrote it down just to get the wording Correct. You know, in the end, it was a good process. We were pushed to include really interesting additional details. So that stuff about the students in Dhaka, I knew a little bit about, but not that much. But because I was pushed to prove that there was an issue, I went away and read, you know, kind of other people's academic work on what had happened at that point. But what they said, what the editor said to us was, please be aware we don't publish opinion pieces. So please make sure that you back up what you're saying with research and news, which was an odd thing to say. Like, what is opinion anyway? What is research? What is news? And how do we position ourselves? I think particularly as scholars from the arts and humanities as well, you know, what else is are our disciplines other than actually informed commentary, which is what the conversation is supposed to publish. So there was a definite little interplay there that we managed to get through and communicate what we wanted to communicate, but it was challenging. It was bounded, definitely.
Thank you, Claire. Thanks so much for that. So in the interest of time, we will move on to the next speaker. But first of all, let's thank Claire for her talk. Hi, Katie.
Hello, hello.
Hi, we can hear you very well. So I'm just going to introduce you here. Thank you so much, and thanks for your patience. And I'll just suggest that maybe you can keep your camera on at this point, and because we're going to the roundtable discussion as well, and we'll all be visible together that way.
Perfect.
So I'm now presenting. Yeah, we can. Sorry, Katie, we're just turning the lights down a bit here. The ones at the front are this one. Yeah, great. We can see you really well now. So Katherine Bogen is a PhD student in clinical psychology at the University of Nebraska, Lincoln, and a Reconstructionist Jewish woman. Raised in an American Jewish household by the son of a Holocaust survivor, Katherine was taught of the promise of Israel from early childhood. She studied Israel's apartheid system and Jewish marginalization in college, where she received a BA in political science and developed her pro-Palestine liberatory politic. She applies insights from her doctoral program to the intergenerational trauma of Palestinians who have systematically displaced, brutalized, and violated. Her posts on Jewish-Muslim solidarity have been shared millions of times on Instagram and TikTok across the Arab world by human rights advocates and by US senators and representatives. I would thoroughly encourage you to follow her on social media. As an activist and academic, she's dedicated to full safety and political enfranchisement for Palestinians and Jews from the river to the sea. And her talk is titled Unlearning Zionism, How Diaspora Jews Can Recognize the Intergenerational Trauma of Palestine. Thank you, Katie.
Thank you all so much. I'm delighted to be here. I'm so excited to speak with you all and to learn as well from my fellow presenters who have done such a beautiful job, I think, framing this conversation, not so much as a quote unquote two-sided issue, but as a clarification of a genocide, of apartheid, of colonialism, and the violence of ethno-national statehood. So I'll dive into my talk, and I'm really eager to take your questions. So my name is Katie. My pronouns are she, her, and my official job, quote unquote, is as a sex researcher and trauma therapist at the University of Nebraska, where I'm currently a doctoral student in clinical psychology. I am a queer Reconstructionist Jewish woman, and I was raised by a deeply, passionately Zionist Jewish family. I myself am a staunch anti-Zionist, and I believe that my own process of unlearning can be socially contagious for other diaspora Jews who are beginning to interrogate their own Zionist upbringings. My grandfather was in the Warsaw Ghetto and part of the Polish underground resistance movement. His entire family, parents, cousins, aunts, and uncles, were slaughtered in Nazi-occupied Poland and in concentration camps. His two sisters, Helen and Vela, my namesake, were the only people in my family besides my grandfather Stash to survive. One sister, my great-aunt Helen, was a victim of Dr. Mengele, the death angel. She emerged from the camps gynecologically traumatized. She could no longer have children. She was in Ravensbrück and then Buchenwald and eventually liberated on a death march from the camp. Her motto, and one that I was taught by my family, was don't be a bystander. When evil is happening, speak up, intervene, and do something. I was raised by the son of a Holocaust survivor, and every year during the Passover Seder, like most diaspora Jewish families, we made the pledge, next year in Israel. I was taught the framing of Israel as a land without a people for a people without a land. I now understand that this framing is ridiculous. I was taught of this promise of a glittering, fantastical, sacred nation where no one would throw coins at me for being Jewish. No one would ask, is it true what they say about Jewish girls? No one would joke about my horns or my tail. No one would use anti-Semitic dog whistles about globalists. No one would toss up Nazi salutes in school hallways and attempt to be edgy or controversial. Israel represented the promise of safety and liberation, and it took me 18 years to begin investigating that promise, whether it could possibly be grounded in truth. And in doing so, I've had to ask myself some really challenging and critical questions. Whose oppression, whose marginalization, whose suffering, or whose death is demanded, is required for that fiction to be realized? My friends and relatives began going on birthright when I started college. And by that time, I'd spent enough of my life in leftist activist spaces to at least ask the question or present the question of what about Palestine? And when these people whom I deeply loved and respected countered my questions with, you mean the terrorists? I was disturbed. The sudden xenophobia from my typically open-minded family and friends just didn't sit well with me, and I knew that I had to learn more. So during my undergraduate education at Clark University, I majored in comparative political science, and I took 4 formal classes on the conflict, which I now understand is more appropriately referred to as a genocide. My courses were Jewish experience, suffering and evil in the Jewish tradition, Middle East politics, and Arab-Israeli conflict. In these courses, I learned about Theodor Herzl, the atheistic father of modern Zionism. I learned about the first aliyah, or waves of Jewish settlement in historic Palestine, a land and people which sheltered Jews from the violent anti-Semitism of Eastern Europe and white supremacy during World Wars I and II. I learned about the Nakba, the brutal displacement of Palestinians from their ancestral homeland beginning in 1948 and continuing to present day. I studied settlements, Jewish Zionist ethno-nationalism, the prioritization in Israel of Ashkenazi ancestry or Eastern European ancestry, and the carceral policing of Gaza and the West Bank. I observed scholarly comparisons between Zionism as a political strategy and apartheid South Africa. And I recognized the role of Britain and the United States in facilitating the creation of Israel to circumvent the immigration of Jews to quote unquote their countries. Israel was never intended to be a gift for Jews. It was intended to be a space where a majority white population, these Eastern European Jews, could serve as a military apparatus for colonial organizations in the US and in Britain. I did wind up going on birthright. I have very mixed feelings about that now, and I want us to sit with the name birthright for a moment. For those who are not familiar, birthright is a subsidized vacation, essentially, for Jewish youth outside of Israel to take to Israel. It is a 10-day trip that is fully paid for. Your flights are paid for, and you spend time, in theory, getting to know the land of Israel. And this name implies to me that people, Jews outside of Israel, diaspora Jews, have a birthright to a land that Palestinians have been forcibly removed from, expelled from, and violated on for the last 75 years. And this trip really solidified my support of Palestine. I experienced when I was there this sleight of hand of look out the window to your left and see an orchard or a grove, and don't look out the other window where you'll see the deep poverty of Arab Israeli neighborhoods and neighborhoods that are disenfranchised in Israel. Meet the Bedouin tribes who are going to feed you and give you tea, and please conveniently ignore the fact that this is one of their few means of acquiring capital because Israel has so restricted their access to land, labor, and compensation. Make Jewish babies, fall in love with Jewish soldiers, make aliyah, so that is become an Israeli citizen and pledge your loyalty to the Zionist project, and do your conscripted service. The role of birthright is to force diaspora Jewish youth to buy into this nationalistic mythology. It's really presented as quite sexy. And I fought with my tour guide on this trip. I asked about the water crisis and border encroachment, settlements, demolition of Palestinian groves and orchards and homes, rates of incarceration, and I essentially served as the birthright trip rabble-rouser. Because the clear bias and the brainwashing effort on my birthright trip, the propaganda of the trip solidified my criticism of Israeli Zionism. So following this trip in 2014, during another wave of violence against Gaza, I quote unquote came out as pro-Palestine publicly to my family and my community. I believe it was in a Facebook post. And my father is a single father. He has a gay brother, and he was thrilled when I came out as bisexual as an early teen because he got to prove that he was going to be a progressive, affirming Jewish dad. He was so excited by my queer identity, much less so when I came out as pro-Palestine. So I was at my work study in the Clark University Sociology Department. He saw my Facebook post and he called me at work. And I remember him yelling at me, and my father rarely yells, yelling at me so loudly on the phone that I had to hold my phone away from my ear. And my boss came into the room and was like, "Who is shouting at you on the phone like that?" And I was like, "Oh, it's my dad just found out that I support Palestine." She was like, "Okay," not getting involved. And I sort of waited for him to be done yelling, told him I was at work and I would call him later, and hung up the phone. And this is just one very small example of the kind of interfamilial, interpersonal policing that happens when young diaspora Jews come out as pro-Palestine to their families. In part, my passion for this movement has come from my observation of hypocrisy. Every time Palestinians resist their occupation, they are painted as violent, brutal, and death hungry. Meanwhile, we are watching videos circulate of Israeli occupation force soldiers mocking grieving mothers, doing makeup tutorials with the makeup that they find in Palestine's rubble, doing TikTok choreography prior to land invasions. I struggle to understand how the side that is being mass murdered are painted as the villains, while the colonizing entity is allowed to literally publicly grave dance. This is beyond me. And so in these intervening years, I've learned to sort of overcome the discomfort of my Jewish community to continue speaking about Palestine, because I have discovered that people listen to me. I look like a cute little white Disney femme. I know how to be charming and performative. Because of white supremacy and gender norms and patriarchy, I am perceived as non-threatening. This means I'm given the latitude to speak without violent policing. I've been able to build a rapid following on social media, on both TikTok and Instagram, because people will actually hear this message from a cute little Disney fam diaspora Jewish girl. Even though I know that I am not saying anything that Palestinian activists haven't already said for 75 years. And we have to acknowledge that there is an ick factor here. There is a grotesque inability of human beings to hear challenging things from people against whom they already have a bias. So using my privilege in this way is my job if I want to live my values of egalitarianism, equity, nonviolence, etc. And this privilege has afforded me some resilience to the trolling that was mentioned earlier. A few weeks into me going kind of viral on social media, I was targeted at my institution by Zionist scholars. They emailed all of my bosses at UNL, at South Shore Sexual Health Center, where I lecture, at the advocacy office, where I serve as a therapist, and told my bosses and supervisors that I was pro-terrorism and that I delight in Jewish death. And I'm very fortunate that I'm able to use my academic achievements and my CV and my charm and my privilege as a shield or as a buffer against punishment, because I have accomplished quite a bit and my bosses are willing to go to the mat for me. And the people who have seen me lecture know that I can be charming and engaging, and they want to continue using that skill. And so because I am marketable and because I am able, I have some protection from criticism. And I'm also very fortunate that my institutions have endorsed this right for free speech and have gone to bat for me when Zionist scholars have accused me of being pro-terror. So in this context of academia, in my doctoral work, I study violence. I've studied the bystander effect, which is the tendency of fewer and fewer people to intervene when they see violence. if more people are present. So the more people who are present for violent incidents, the less likely it is for people to intervene because of diffusion of responsibility, because no one thinks that they're the ones who actually have to take action. I've studied DARVO, which is a narcissistic psychopathic manipulation tactic. It stands for deny, attack, and reverse victim and offender. And it's a strategy that Israel has often used to circumnavigate any criticism of their human rights abuses. I've studied intergenerational trauma and epigenetics, post-traumatic stress disorder treatments. It's interesting to me that we call PTSD present traumatic stress disorder in Palestine, particularly in Gaza, because these folks have never been given the latitude to move beyond traumatic stress. They are traumatized chronically. I've studied slow violence and genocide, as well as constructs of cultural genocide, with Gaza as a case study. And I've worked on interventions to prevent violence, to prevent embodied violence, using academic sources like the Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, and scholarship. Because I'm a queer academic, I've also been given the latitude to challenge some of the pinkwashing that's been done in the context of this conflict, where people say, oh, Palestine is homophobic, and so why would you as a queer person support Palestine? And I'm eager to talk about this during the Q&A, but something that I have said many times and will continue to say is it is impossible to work for the liberation of queer people if you're dead. It's impossible to liberate other queer people if you're so busy grieving your lovers who are dead. How can they possibly get to a point of engaging in queer affirming activism if their day-to-day work, labor, and stuff is of survival? Which is not to say as well that queer Palestinian activists don't exist, because of course they do. So all of this to say, I have been able to condense and compile some of my academic work into work that I think is more compelling for a broad population, which is art and narrative. Art and narrative can be change-making resources. The use of poetry, the use of social media, the use of resources to which we have access in order to target the perpetrators with corrective information, to direct solidarity and validation towards victims and people experiencing violence, and to live allyship more consistently in practice toward hopefully shifting perspectives. I've chosen often to do this through poetry, short videos, and questioning, and I'd like to share one of those poems with you all now as a wrap up. This poem is called When It Was Us, and it is a parallel between my family history and what is currently happening in Gaza. And it's likely that I cry when I'm reading it because I am a big feelings emotional person, and I hope to share that all with you. So, my grandfather and his sister garroted occupying soldiers in the ghetto. Years later, they spoke of the decapitations, the blood on their hands, over dinner, either numb or proud, and both alive, survivors of genocide. We did not judge them for their brutality. We did not ask them why they didn't take to the occupation of Warsaw more gently. I would smile to hear of their rebellion. I held the salt and the blood in my teeth. Those are my ancestors, I thought. I came from their resistance. I came from resilience and rage against an oppressor, a vile foe who sought to cage and to kill us. They did all that violence, held the wire, and gambled their souls for the possibility of an us someday. And because of their willingness to claw and scrap, to smuggle hand grenades, to fight the guards of their very own camps, my sisters and I are here. I think that Palestinian children must worship at the altar of every Palestinian grown-up trying to save their lives. I think they must look at their parents and neighbors, their cousins and aunties and uncles, their own bubbies and zadis, warring against the IOF soldiers who patrol the barrier walls around Gaza, and think it is by the bravery of each person willing to claw and scrap against this vile foe that Palestine exists at all. I think they must thank God and their ancestors and all the dead who gave their lives to escape a camp, just like my grandfather's mother and father, that Palestine exists at all. I think the children must heroize those trying to protect them, the possibility of them, like the Jews of the Warsaw Ghetto tried to protect the possibility of us, and how we have honored them, and how blind we are now to dishonor them. I think the children of Palestine are just like me and my sisters in that someone is fighting to keep them safe, to keep them possible. Fighting with violence, yes, with bloody hands against an oppressor turning Gaza, the oldest active concentration camp, into a mass grave. I think my grandfather would be proud of me for knowing that Palestinian children, that all Palestinian people deserve a possibility. I think my grandfather would see the parallels, the horrors of this, the Holocaust, the underground, the treasure map from one spirit of resistance to another, and remind us of how he fought when it was us, and it was us, for the possibility of an us. I think he would think of the children of Palestine and picture my face and my little sister's face and my older sister's face. I think he would think of the children of Gaza, whatever children are still alive. And I will leave you with the words of Heba Abu Nada, Palestinian poet, writer, literary powerhouse who was killed in an Israeli airstrike several weeks ago. She was a brilliant, remarkable creative, a voice for her people, and 32 years old. I just turned 30. We find ourselves in an indescribable state of bliss amidst the chaos. Amidst the ruins, a new city emerges, a testament to our resilience. Cries of pain echo through the air, mingling with the blood-stained garments of doctors. Teachers, despite their grievances, embrace their little pupils, while families display unwavering strength in the face of adversity. She wrote this and was slaughtered 48 hours later. Thank you for your time.
Katie, thank you so much. I really, really wish you could be here with us. But what I can tell you and what you probably can't see is that there are a lot of people incredibly moved. And so you have, from the distance, touched us, and you are present with us in that way. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
Okay, let's open up to questions. We have 1, 2, 3. Okay, let's start there, and I'll come round this way, actually.
I don't have anything really specific to ask, but if you could speak a bit more about pinkwashing and the effect that it's had on activists and some of the pushback they've gotten.
Thank you. There were 2 other questions over here, I think. Yeah.
And you had from before as well.
Okay. Yeah, I'd just like to thank you for a very moving talk, and also, you know, kind of outlining really the profound struggle of being able to identify that something that you've been fed kind of your whole life is kind of the reversal of that. I guess my question, if you can answer, is kind of twofold. The initial thing of potentially your musings on how early Zionist propaganda was so effective in manipulating, and I guess kind of like Zionist propaganda facilitated by colonial thought at the time, European at the time, how it so easily manipulated kind of European Jews to then not only go to Palestine, but then fight in what they call the Wars of Independence, which is just another genocide so soon after their own profound suffering and genocide, especially kind of Polish Jewish people who were both cursed as Eastern European and cursed further as people of kind of the Jewish minority in the slaughter in Europe, how they were able to, rather than hate Europe, hate the Arab and put the us and them. And then the second question as a follow-up to that would be, how, I mean, in your very personal spheres, such as your father, can kind of see the same heroes as you do, like your grandfather, his father, and use the same voice, the same identity to come to the complete antithetical conclusion as where you use your grandfather to show that genocide should never be repeated, potentially, naturally don't know your father's opinion, but that he would then use it as a justification for the state of Israel. If potentially you can illuminate my understanding of these kind of processes. Thank you.
So I'm not going to ask my question.
Okay, I think that's our 2 questions for now, Katie.
Okay. Well, I will start with the question about pinkwashing, because I think there is this false narrative that has been disseminated that there are silos where you can either be queer or be Palestinian and not both. And the erasure of queer Palestinians has allowed for the proliferation of pinkwashing, where people say, okay, well, Palestine isn't a very queer supportive space, and thus any queer person who supports Palestine is betraying the queer community. It's fundamentally built on a lie. I know many queer Palestinians who are a little bit more private. They're able to, maintain their queer identity in a family system, in a social system, but not necessarily be out on social media. They won't necessarily be able to marry their partner, but they still have very lasting partnerships that are legitimate. And so this idea that queerness is itself counter to the Palestinian mission doesn't make any sense to me. And I do think we can't possibly imagine what queer liberation would have looked like in Palestine, what queer celebration could have looked like in Palestine without 75 years of violence and oppression. People have to work toward survival before working toward other progressive issues. It's sometimes not possible to prioritize. And I think there's a false equivalency set up, or lack of equivalency, I should say, as if Israel is this incredibly queer affirming place, but it is not. It is not. There is plenty of queer phobia and homophobia in Israel, just as there is in the United States. And I think queer liberation is so wrapped up in all processes of liberation, of all processes of anti-violence, where if you really want to take on the mantle of liberation movements, human rights, egalitarianism, and equity, you have to see your humanity in other people, and you have to see your queerness in other people. And I do think for me, meeting queer Palestinian people who have been working toward the liberation of queer folks in Palestine has been a beautiful mechanism of solidarity building, and allowed me to view all of this pinkwashing as frankly absurd. Like it doesn't track for me anymore. And so I hope that this conversation can be a bit of a learning and an unlearning process. And to the question of how did this propaganda work in terms of, immediately post World War II, facilitating a secondary war, I think the predication of the imagination of Israel on emptiness was very effective. This idea of a land without a people for a people without a land, people took it seriously. They bought it. They bought that Palestine was kind of this empty expanse prior to the first Aliyah. And of course, we know that that was untrue. But I think part of the Jewish legacy is one of trauma. And people tend to expect that trauma is going to build empathy and build compassion. And that is not so, and certainly has not been so in our collective history, where I strongly believe that Jewish trauma has hardened our hearts, has caused us to turn off our empathy and turn off our compassion, also in service of survival, where if we have to think about the people we're harming in order for our people to persist, there's a pain in that. There's a pain in experiencing compassion and empathy. And so if you're able to toggle that off, you can fight for your survival more effectively and not really care about the harm that you cause. And something that I noticed when I was on Birthright and as I've interfaced with other Jewish people in the last decade, is the folks that I've met in my life who have the darkest, most inappropriate, most violent senses of humor have been IOF soldiers who are so kind of damaged by their family's history and by collective Jewish trauma that they're able to turn off their empathy. It's fascinating, I think, to observe. And this dovetails with my answer to the last question, which is how how have my father and I come to very, very different conclusions about where my grandfather would stand on this issue? And I think we have different imaginings of my grandfather. My father imagines my grandfather as broken by the Holocaust, broken in his empathy, really worried about the struggle for survival. And I think my imagination has been more compassionate to my grandfather in that I imagine him as healed. And I think a healed version of my grandfather, a non-traumatized version, or a version who's been able to sort of cope with his trauma, go to therapy, etc., would feel such compassion for Palestine and for Palestinian children because of his own struggle. And so we have to move as a Jewish people beyond our collective imagining of ourselves as broken toward a collective imagining of ourselves as healed. That is where the compassion building happens. That's where our capacity for empathy is really constructed. And part of my work as a trauma therapist has enabled me to do that. I really think my professional sphere has facilitated my ability to do that. But I think where older generations of Jewish Zionists get lost is they are still so, I don't want to use the phrase broken to describe my ancestors, but they have a lot of damage that they have not worked through and collective trauma that they have not worked through. And my generation has a little bit more space and more buffer from that hurt and are thus able to recognize the humanity of Palestine, I think, more effectively. I hope that answered all of your questions.
Brilliant. Thank you, Katie. I can see there are a lot of questions online, but in the interest of time, I'm afraid we're going to have to privilege the discussion in the room, and hopefully we might have time to open up later. So I know the event was advertised until 9 o'clock. We're not going to go on until 9 o'clock. Yeah, it's already been a long 2 hours, but I do want to make sure we have time and space for a general discussion. And so what I'm going to suggest that we do is that I'm going to be awful and be incredibly strict with time. I'm going to put a 3-minute alarm on my phone. That's what I'm going to do. And I'm going to ask our respondents one by one to speak to as many issues that they want to and feel they can speak to in that time. And then I'm going to open up to questions from the general public. I hope that feels okay and that works. Responding to what's come up and just kind of speaking to, yeah, do you want to, yeah. Okay, so let me, sorry, I'll pass the mic on. Just let me get set up here with my awful timer. Did you want to begin, Hajar? Yeah.
Oh, okay. Thank you for your excellent talk, which covers nearly everything. I wanted to just add also my thoughts, which are very much aligned with this PTSD thing of like of the children and the people of Gaza. We have to recognize that this mental health framework doesn't really work for the people of Gaza. Why? It's because PTSD relies on someone not being traumatized before in order to then label them as traumatized now. But realistically, the people in Gaza, as well as the third-generation refugees of the diaspora and around, have never really escaped this perpetual existential crisis that Palestinians are faced with from birth. And with this Darvo tactic that you talked about, it's also very interesting because I keep repeating that every Zionist accusation is actually a confession. So the way they reverse the blame based off of what they have done, you know, it's very easy for them to do because they know exactly what they did and they can twist it very well. And in terms of the pinkwashing, I mean, yeah, as you said, like Israel is not necessarily also, they would like to say they're the only democracy in the Middle East. They would like to say that they're you know, queer people are safe in Israel. But the reality is that I mean, gay marriage isn't legal in Israel. That's a start. And also they are partly and greatly responsible for also the oppression of queers in Palestine. You know, there's so many tactics that have been documented where they use queer Palestinians and threaten them with evidence that they've collected on them being queer and outing them to the community in order to force them to collaborate with the Israeli state and sort of pass on knowledge on Palestinians that are part of the resistance or whatever Palestinians are doing in the neighborhood. What else can I? Yeah.
Thank you, Hajar, for those reflections. Bashir?
I don't think I have much to. I was really thank you, Katie, for your intervention, and thank you, Hajar. Actually, both Hajar and Katie were really very eye-opening. I find very eloquent, and I don't really have anything to add. But maybe with the questions arising from the audience and people online, I can maybe.
Thank you, Bashir, and I just want to invite you as well, Katie, to respond. You know. Beyond your talk, to anything that you've heard today that you want to kind of respond to.
Yeah, I mean, I think something that continues to strike me is the limitations of our language, where I find myself even referring to Jewish people living outside of Israel as the diaspora, but that itself implies that the Jewish homeland is Israel and that people external from Israel are diasporic. And I want to counter that. When I talk about the Jewish diaspora, I don't just mean Jews who are external from Israel. I mean Jews who are external from any of their ancestral homelands, including Poland and Germany and Russia and Tunisia and Morocco and Spain. There are just places that we sort of neglect to mention when we talk about diasporic Jews, and I don't want to contribute to the linguistic violence of implying that Jewish homeland is Israel. I fundamentally disagree with that. And I think something that I keep hearing over and over again that has brought up the hypocrisy and the cognitive dissonance of Zionist Jews is a dual argument of the only safe space for Jews is in Israel, and you are so privileged and safe in America that you can talk about the oppression of Palestinians. And I really struggle with this toggling of which one is it? Is the only safe space for Jews in Israel, or am I so safe and privileged as a Jewish person in America that I can't possibly understand the risk and the threat that Israeli Zionists experience? So that's something that's come up quite a bit, at least cognitively for me over the last few days, is how are people overcoming this cognitive dissonance for themselves? And I do think the process of being traumatized impacts folks' cognitive functioning, impacts their ability to think critically about other people's oppression, because the survival motive is so loud and so noisy that takes priority over any kind of critical thought. So that's, I guess, those are the two things I'm ruminating on right now.
That's great. Thank you so much, Katie. And thank you all for being well under 3 minutes. Bashir, you wanted to add something?
I now want to add something from what Katie was saying. In terms of paradigm shifts and you know how to move language in order to express something that is not really easy to express, I just want to express one thing. Coming from the Arab world, I feel the relationship between confessions and sects and religion, or whatever we want to call them, Jews, Christians, Muslims, etc., it is very different from the way it works in the West. And I feel one of the issue with the Zionist project is that it actually brought into the Middle East, or whatever we're going to call the region, another controversial term, a project that is very much mirrored on European, on a European kind of nationalist, rigid, black and white kind of sense, if not maybe even discriminating against groups. Whereas prior to that, the Middle East, and it actually perdures in the Middle East, the relationship between Jews, Christian, and Muslims have never been problematic like it was, say in Europe. And I say this from something I've lived. There's Jewish families that still live in Lebanon. There's still, there's Jews in Morocco. There's Jews everywhere. There's also Christians in Palestine, Lebanon, everywhere. And the relationship between groups there is just a bit different. They're less stigmatized as being very different. Okay, this is the Christian group. This is the. So, for example, I had this conversation with this woman once, who's a Moroccan Jewish woman who moved to Israel, and she married this Tunisian friend of mine, and I was staying at their home one time. It was a while ago, and I was arguing with her, saying, "Okay, you're Jewish, but you're Arab," and she was like, "No, I'm Jewish." I was like, "Yeah, but you're from Morocco, so you speak Arabic." She said, "Yes, but I'm not an Arab." But I was like, "Okay, but you know, people who are from the Arab world can call themselves Arab and be Jewish and be Christian," and so that kind of dichotomy is very hard to come by. And I've had these discussions here in Scotland and academic conferences sometimes, where I would talk to people. I remember this scholar actually at the University of Edinburgh. He was telling me, no, Jewishness is an ethnicity. It's basically a race. I mean, this is the 19th century kind of right-wing kind of argument. And I was like, no, it's maybe a multitude of races. It's a multitude of groups and ethnicities and people intermarrying and stuff, just like Christians and other groups. So I feel like, changing that is a bit hard.
Do you want to come in again, Hajar? Okay. Okay, let's open up to questions then. We have questions online as well. I'll take 1, 2 questions. I'll take 3 questions from the floor, and then I'll take some questions online after a round of answers. And I'll start over here.
Hi, thank you all for your very insightful interventions. I have a question, I guess about what might come after liberation struggles. And obviously we are here being very fairly justly critical of this framing, of this conflating of the Palestine people with Hamas, and of that with terrorism. And obviously that is something that we need to resist very strongly. But then basically, how can the liberation struggle for Palestine be reclaimed from Hamas, I guess, is my question. And how do we stop and this is something that has happened for many liberation struggles everywhere, in many places, where the people who are doing the armed resistance, because are the ones who have the guns, then wield power in oppressive ways on their own populations later on. So that's my question.
There was a question over here, I think. Yeah.
So yeah, in a lot of your statements, you mentioned, all the speakers mentioned concepts like settler colonialism, the state media, politicians, and other colonial structures, and that in sort of looking that in the framework of the Middle East and the Palestinian struggle for freedom, how does that analysis kind of move on to the state itself as an idea, as an ideological concept that was forced onto the Middle East by these colonial structures? And then how can we sort of like start to question that concept within this framework, and as perhaps the main source of the oppression of the Palestinian people and all Middle Eastern peoples and ethnic groups? Thank you.
And one more question up here.
Yeah, thanks so much to all the panelists. My question is kind of based on, I was quite struck by the contrast between the Western response to the Russian attack on Ukraine compared to how the West has reacted to the recent Israeli attack on Gaza. And I remember in 2022, you had so many Western politicians kind of using the language of liberation in regards to Ukraine, and they have completely done the opposite, essentially, with regards to Palestine. And I think it's exposed to a lot of people how kind of cynical, supposed Western humanitarian kind of solidarity is. And so considering how kind of selective Western international solidarity is and how self-serving it seems to be, how can we change that kind of cynicism on an international stage, really?
Who would like to take the initial response?
Katie, would you like to start?
Yes, I can start. So I might need a reminder of the very first question, but I'll pivot to the nationhood and sort of settler colonialism question, which I believe was the second, of how has the Western idea, the settler colonial idea of the state been weaponized against Palestine. And I've seen this in my comments section again and again and again of, well, Palestine wasn't technically a state, quote unquote, before 1948. And fundamentally, that's untrue. I mean, there were passports that said Palestine on them. There was clearly some structure. But I come back to, I don't know if y'all are familiar with the comedy of Eddie Izzard, now I believe Susie Izzard, and the comedy routine of Do You Have a Flag? And that being used against India during Britain's colonization of India, saying basically no flag, no country, because of this rule that I just made up. And that same logic is being applied to Palestinian statehood of, well, if they didn't have a flag, then they don't really count. And thus it's okay if we do absolutely anything to them. And the logic of that to me just doesn't follow. It's just because someone doesn't have a flag doesn't mean you can then rape their people, pillage their land, mass murder them, force them to leave, and take over whatever was theirs. That is such a nationalistic enterprise. And I do think so many liberation movements come back to the statement of no nation, no borders, no nation, no borders, because so much of the violence done between groups of people has been done in honor of these things that we imagine that are constructs. Statehood is a construct. It is something that we built to sort of make sense of the world, but we did indeed build it, and we can, I think, unbuild it. So when we talk about the sort of two-state solution for Israel-Palestine, that two-state solution has failed. Israel killed that two-state solution by use of settlements and continued acquisition of land. And so even when we think about a single secular state, we're still applying a construct of statehood there, when really, I think shifting toward a more liberal and sort of liberatory politic of enfranchisement could be more useful. Of, okay, we have to sort of deal with states because of global national imaginations, but reparations is going to be one of the central tenets of that quote unquote statehood, of how do we sort of re-enfranchise people who have had their orchards and groves stolen from them and had their dignity raped and violated and brutalized away for 75 years. I think applying more liberatory politic constructs like reparations, transformative justice, restorative justice is going to allow a path forward more so than the focus on this sort of settler colonial nationalistic project. I hope that was clarifying for folks. I might have raised more questions than answers.
Yeah, to also add on, unfortunately, like I explained, like we're trapped in it, working within this framework that really isn't meant for us, you know. Self-determination, you know, it's been so much as we said, like it's been coveted by a European settler community, you know, and we have to work within this liberal framework, unfortunately. But what I want to stress is that although nationalism is a political reality, you know, nation states aren't, but they are the result of nationalism. So once we can, it begins here, you know, it begins with this detangling of this politicization of different groups of people for statehood, you know. What we dream of when we dream of Palestinian liberation is not, like I said, it's almost metaphysical now, you know, like it's freedom in general. But for us, a Palestinian state, you know, where everyone can live in Palestine freely, also means that these borders are not as rigid as they should be, you know, that we can be like our our grandparents, you know, our great grandparents. We can go from one land of people to another. You know, we can move from Jerusalem to Beirut to Damascus, and so forth. You know, but yeah, nationalism engenders nations, unfortunately, and Zionism is one of the most powerful examples of, if not the most powerful example of ethno-nationalism. So yeah, it begins by dismantling that. In terms of your question earlier as well, like I used to think of it as double standards, you know, I used to think of it as like hypocrisy of the West and whatnot, but I think it's so fundamental to the functioning of Western civilization to other us and to vilify us that it really isn't a double standard. It's the way it's set up. That's why it's so taboo to talk about Palestine, because it puts all of that into question. You know, it's not just a given, even though the facts are there and directly relatable to Ukrainian liberation. Yeah.
Just to answer the question on Hamas, I think nobody addressed that. I think it's hard to say, okay, we should do away with Hamas, or we should do away with this party or that party, or because it's not really up to us to really do that. We can be critical of Hamas. We can condemn even Hamas if we want, you know, as the fashion on media is today. I mean, of course, you know, you can criticize, and everybody does all sorts of actions that are condemnable, and including the Israeli state. But it's like saying, you know, criticizing Hamas is like saying we should eliminate the Likud, you know, party, or we should. Well, it's not up to us, you know. It depends. What are the popular forces at stake? Who is voting for who? How do people express themselves? But I believe personally that if you have a system of, you know, if you have really an actual genuine effort for some kind of just peace along the lines Katie and Hajar are trying to think about, for example, or I mean, you know, if there's really a modicum of effort in that direction, believe me, things like Hamas and things like any other group is going to change. Everything changes according to the environment in which you are, and if they don't change, the people will change. You know, the people will say, okay, this doesn't work for us. You know, Hamas is the expression of a discontent also, and not just Hamas, of course. There's many other groups and etc. So yeah, I just wanted to point that out.
Thank you very much.
I'd like to comment as well on this idea of change in the context of Hamas, and how once we have a certain language, or once people have a certain politic that is actually capable of transformation, because one of the myths that I have heard online over and over and over and over again is that in the Hamas charter, they call for the extermination of Jews. And I had heard that enough times that I decided to go read the 2017 Hamas charter, which is the updated version of sort of their political goals. It has those 42 points, and nowhere in the 2017 Hamas charter does it call for the extermination of Jews. In fact, in points 16 and 17 of the charter, it talks about how the conflict of Hamas is not with the Jewish people, it's with the Zionist state of Israel, it's with their political goals, and that all of their effort to sort of gain liberation from this political project of Israel is not a conflict with Jewish people in and of themselves, and that in this imagining of Palestine, there are Jewish people. And so Hamas did the work, so to speak, of going back to their original charter, seeing what in it was anti-Semitic or violent towards Jews as a religious group, and revised it. And they do name, too, in point 17 of the charter, that there is a quote-unquote Jewish problem, and that the world is anti-Semitic, that there is a violence enacted toward Jewish people, that violence was born in Europe, enacted through World Wars I and II, and that Jewish people are also suffering. Like, there's some recognition of the humanity of Jewish people in the Hamas charter that is entirely erased when people talk about the violence, quote unquote, of Hamas. And I do very much agree with Bashir's point that we can't, make these decisions for the people of Palestine. Hamas still has, I think, 40% popular support in Palestine, and Hamas also has 4 different branches. There is the armed resistance branch, and also a branch that is in charge of education and political administration and healthcare. And when we talk about Hamas in sort of the public imagination right now, we are condensing them to one aspect of their movement that is not even their central goal. So just wanted to name that.
Yeah, exactly that. Just to directly quote Article 16 of their charter, Hamas affirms that its conflict is with the Zionist project, not with the Jews because of their religion. Hamas does not wage a struggle against the Jews because they are Jewish, but wages a struggle against the Zionists who occupy Palestine. Yet it is the Zionists who constantly identify Judaism and the Jews with their own colonial project and illegal entity. It's also important to remember that, and this is no secret or conspiracy, that Israel had a big role to play in the development of Hamas. So Mujamma, which preceded Hamas, was heavily funded by Israel to shut down other secular movements and parties in Palestine. And then once Hamas, once Mujamma became Hamas, and which was basically, the PLO was also considered a terrorist organization, and so Hamas was meant to shut down Arafat and Fatah movement. What then they realized, oh shit, but they played an ugly game of divide and conquer, so we can't really we can't envision what's next until this divide and conquer is undone, and and the land is liberated and people have their freedom. What then the political landscape of Palestine would look like, because it would operate under completely different conditions than what it does now. Yeah.
Thank you, everyone. We have been terribly exclusive of our online participants. We're very, very short on time now, but I just want to open up to a couple of what I would plead are short and concise questions, and one very last round of responses, if you'll allow me to entertain that. So first of all, we have Ali. Ali, I'm going to allow camera and allow mic. Ali, what is your question?
Okay, thank you again. But I have 2 questions. Can I combine them in one, please? Just like in a short run. Okay.
They're
so
very
the first
short,
one,
Ali. If you can make them short.
Yeah. All right. So the first one was for Hajar, I believe, when she was talking about the Accord of Oslo in 1993, and it was like peace process, which is not true. Actually, it was like Israel only recognizing the PLO just to talk about peace, only to talk, which never happened again. And the question is here, throughout the years, like since 1948 until now, the international law has failed us dramatically. And I was wondering, what is left for us to do except just for talk when the media and the people and decision makers are not with our side? So that was the first question. The second one was for Katie. You identified yourself, I think, at the beginning as like diaspora Jewish, as I believe. And I was wondering, like, considering what Bashir also mentioned, that the Jews in Middle East lived in peace with Christians, Muslims, and basically the problem was in Europe, and it was a European issue that was pushed to us throughout the World War I and II, and the Jews were expelled from so many countries. And to have a diaspora, you're supposed to have an origin. For example, like the Palestinians, they are right now in diaspora because they got expelled from their own country. And for the Jews, again, as Bashir mentioned, you can have multitude. You're not just one race. So how is that still a thing? Shouldn't Jews belong to the country they were born in? Like if you're born in the US, then you're American, or France or the UK, and that should be the problem of the country itself, not not the religion. And thank you. That's
Thank you, Ali. Thank you for your questions. I'm going to disable mic and disable camera and open up to one last question from Keat. I'm not sure I'm saying your name correctly there. You can correct me. I'm going to allow your mic and allow your camera. And please give us your short, concise question.
Hi, everyone. Well, thank you, first of all, to everyone for your time and knowledge, and also for sharing your kind of vulnerabilities with us. I really appreciate that. I'm a German. I've lived in Israel and Palestine for some years. And I find myself, with a lot of people who kind of don't share my views. I've seen the occupation and all of that. And obviously, with Germany, we know what the kind of stance there is. And so I get tempted a lot to, try and engage in dialogues with people who are just so, on the opposite fence from me. And I would like to believe that it's a good thing to, to do that. And I would like to believe that it's something that, should be encouraged in our societies, and that it's helpful in a way. But I guess my question is that a stupid idea? Because oftentimes it doesn't feel like you get anywhere with that. So I guess my question is, should we use our kind of activism or ability to talk with people who are on the other side, and try to plant a seed of kind of doubt in their narrative, or try to help them see things? And if so, what's the best way, I guess, from maybe, Katie, your perspective, to do that effectively? Or is it, just not the right way to kind of use our time at this juncture? Is it hopeless, basically?
Thank you very much. Thank you for your question. I'm going to disable mic and disable camera. And also, just for the sake of equity, we'll invite one more very, very quick, very brief question, please. I'm going to allow mic and camera now for Sewa or Shewa, I'm not sure. Who I believe maybe muted, maybe they're not.
Okay, first,
Hi.
Hi. Actually, I have no question, but I want to tell you something. I'm Palestinian from West Bank, and I actually appreciate this meeting, and I just had a little bit problem with how the Western that they considered as human right and free okay, sorry. And that okay, sorry. They are lying. They just acting on the word that they are with the human right, and they not care about Palestinian blood. Just imagine my friend at my age, 18. We recently just started the university. She go to Jerusalem, but with we do something to go to Jerusalem that Israeli permission, and she just go to Jerusalem without Israeli permission, and they arrested her, and she just 18. Her only her only the mistake she make it's to visit Jerusalem. And actually the war not about Jewish and Muslim. We are so respectful. We are live in peace with the Christian. Why just Jewish? Why you can I have some time to.
Thank.
Siwar, we don't have a lot of time, but we hear your testimony here. We just don't have time too much in the meeting. It's just if you have any questions, then do you have any questions? But we understand.
I wanna tell you last thing, and I just for a minute.
Okay, wait. Do you prefer to speak in another language, and I can translate also if you want? But
can I speak in Arabic?
Yeah, speak in Arabic and I'll translate. But just please be brief. يعني ما تاخذ كثير وقت.
تمام. إنه عن جد كتير قناة مثلا CNN ليش ما عم تعرض الأحداث بطريقة صحيحة؟ ليش دائما هم صارعين راسنا بحقوق الإنسان وحقوق المرأة وكل هاي الشغلات، وبالآخر هم ما بيشوفوا الفلسطينيين أصلا ناس. نتنياهو طلع حكى إحنا بنشوفهم بس حيوانات. طب ليش كل هذا؟ ليش ما في حدا يوقف عند حدا؟ ليش الولايات المتحدة اللي هي عاملة حالها دولة السلام والاحترام والتطور، طب ما هذا لحاله جهل وعقلية رجعية، وما في أي مظهر من مظاهر التطور أو الحرية.
اوكي شكرا سوار، شكرا. رح ترجم شغلتي.
اوكي عفوا، بتمنى ما اكون تقلت عليكم او شيء.
لا ماشي الحال.
شكرا كثير انبسطت بالميتينج تبعكم. رح اخذه لمشروعي بالجامعه لانه اكتشفت في افكار عند الغرب احنا ما بنعرف فيها اصلا، زي عن حماس، عن الفلسطينيين والشغلات هاي. كلها احنا ما بنعرف شيء عنها، فكتير مهم إنه نعرف كيف الغرب كيف بفكروا. فياريت لو تنشروا هذا الإشي أكثر عند العرب.
طيب اوكي شكرا لك سوار. Okay, so Siwar is she's basically denouncing this. Do you want to actually translate?
Siwar was basically saying like, why is the CNN framing it in this way? You know, it's ultimately down to the fact that they don't view us as humans. Netanyahu himself said we are animals and this posed no problem for anyone, and that the UN and so forth and so, like, just the silence of all Western all organizations and international spheres that represent Western thinking and yeah, civilization. So what?
One nice, I mean, nice, it's not nice. One I think important idea is that she contrasted all this talk about international law, human rights, and all this with this discrepancy again that we were talking about in the beginning between all this like lofty discourse compared to a reality that is so dehumanizing, and she was just making that point, no?
Yeah.
So I think we should. Yeah, I think we should round up just with some responses, some final reflections, just one last go around, and then we'll close the panel at that point. Who would like to start?
I think the question addressed to me about like Oslo being a peace process, yeah, I definitely agree. I mean, by no definition is it, well, maybe it represents more so peace, but not justice. But clearly even that compromise can't be made from the occupation side. You know, obviously the Oslo Accords sold very important demands and claims for Palestinian freedom away at the cost of Israel just also not sticking to the Oslo Accords. One of the biggest questions is the right of return, which Arafat just sold off, you know. That this is one of the primary questions of Palestine, is the right of return for all Palestinians in the diaspora, as contrasted with the law of return of Israel, in which any Jewish person born anywhere in the world can, quote unquote, return to Israel. Also about the Germany thing, unfortunately, I was born and I grew up in my childhood in Germany, and I'm sorry, but I can't really even begin to describe the level of silencing and suppression of just the identity itself. I mean, this also relates back to the question on Kurdistan. You know, to me, growing up, I found it very interesting that the German left can so easily associate itself and represent itself through Kurdish liberation, but draws the line at Palestinian liberation. I always wondered why that wasn't easier. You know, I mean, considering we're both from the same region. So another thing about the Germany, yeah, I mean, the German left is I mean, I think it's beyond repair. Like they'll be handing out flyers being like, oh, disarm, anti-military, stop the war, and then the logo of the IOF right next to it. You know, not only that, like it's the identity itself that is criminalized. You know, it's not even like let's not even get to the stage of voicing any political views or demands. Like, but truly, it is so shameful that we have reached a stage where the German state believes that its guilt absolves it of any duty to deal with how they are, of the responsibility. You know, it's really hard. It's such a weird air in Germany, but yeah, we've seen that really freedom of speech, human rights, democracy are all things up to question now. You know, what does it mean when the majority of citizens of said Western democracies want and vote and would vote for a ceasefire, but that is not represented on the you know, governmental level? So what does any of this actually mean? What do human rights mean? What does in the name of democracy mean? You know, so yeah.
Bashir, Katie, go ahead.
Certainly. So I'll address the two questions that were directed toward me. The first being about the idea of the Jewish diaspora and origins of Judaism, and sort of where should our quote unquote nationhood come from or originate. And for me, as a Jewish person living in America, I have some ties to my grandfather's Polish Judaism. I know his hometown in Poland, which was Otwock. And I know that his father was a rabbi there, and my sort of spiritual Jewish origin comes from there. But I feel very much like an American Jew. My socialization has been so different from Jews in other places of the world, and I'm very comfortable identifying as an American Jew. I can feel some tie to my Polish Jewish identity, but I feel no loyalty or tie whatsoever to this idea of Zionist Israeli Judaism being kind of fundamental to my identity or to my faith. And I think part of the damage that is done by the Zionist project in the state of Israel is to all Jews outside of Israel, because every time Israel enacts violence, every time Israel targets Palestine, global anti-Semitism rises, because we're seeing an example of sanctioned Jewish, quote unquote, at least that's what Israel claims to be, Jewish violence against a vulnerable group. And so people who are politically engaged wind up seeing politically engaged and progressive, and who are able to view Palestinians as fully human, see these instances of Jewish violence and believe that Jewish people are inherently violent. And so my risk for experiencing violence because of my Jewish identity goes up every time Israel is violent. Harm toward diaspora Jews or Jews outside of Israel increases every time Israel is violent. And I do not believe that my safety is intrinsically tied to the state of Israel, but I do believe that my risk is intrinsically tied to Israel's decision to be violent. And there's a sort of delegitimation that happens, or failure to see other Jewish identities and Jewish people outside of Israel as Jewish as Israeli Jews. And that also I find quite frustrating. So all this to say, I feel like an American Jew. I feel strongly that I am an American Jew, and Israeli violence does not represent me and other Jewish people. And in terms of the question about, is it fruitless, or should we have hope in terms of engaging in discourse that we can change minds? Before I think I had gone very viral on social media, I might have said no. I might have said that people are so entrenched that I struggle to feel optimistic. But I have gotten so many messages in my inbox, thousands and maybe tens of thousands of messages at this point from other Jewish people saying, I never thought or I never expected I would hear a Jewish woman speak on behalf of Palestine. I never thought I would hear a Jewish woman criticize Israel. And it has made me begin to interrogate where my learning came from and if it is legitimate. And hearing that from other Jewish people, particularly outside of Israel, who have now taken up the mantle of this cause and gone to protest and called their representatives has been, I think, deeply inspiring to me to continue speaking. And I do think there's something to be said from a therapeutic perspective of the compliment sandwich or the kindness sandwich, where you say something affirming or validating first. I often say loss of Jewish life is a devastation to me. 6 million of us were already killed and eradicated. We're so little of the population. I feel strongly about the urgency of global Jewish safety. And what Israel is doing, claiming to be on behalf of the Jewish people, is inexcusable, violent, and genocidal, and I will not identify with it. And Jewish safety can be better guaranteed, maintained, and facilitated external to the Zionist project. We can keep each other safe and have been doing this for 75 years. And I think that speaks to some of the Jewish concerns about eradication. So yes, I think changing hearts and minds is feasible. I think doing so when you start and end with kindness makes it more possible. And I so appreciate all of your time and thoughts today. It's been really a joy spending a few hours with you.
Sorry, just one quick thing. I forgot to answer the is it fruitless thing. I mean, so much of this is a narrative war. So yeah, I mean, it really doesn't hurt to speak to people for as long as you realize that they're actually listening to what you're saying, not just waiting to like debunk it with like propaganda. So that's when it's that's definitely when it's useful. I mean, and Palestinians definitely do this wherever they go. Like I never shy from responding to any questions or whatever, simply to protect my like my moments of grief or whatever. Like I will always try and engage and try and respond so long as it is fruitful. So I would hope that other people can do that on behalf of us as well, when I'm not personally there or other Palestinians aren't necessarily there.
Yeah, I don't have much to add to this. This is great. I do think there's a hope. I know we're in the midst of a war. It's horrible what's happening, but you know, I think maybe it's in these moments where the the urgency of hope is becomes, you know. So what Katie said, what Hajar is saying is so true, and there is a possibility of change, and especially here where you can, you know, you have representative governments to a certain extent, at least. I know it sounds like nothing is really working democratically right now, but you know, eventually it should, and there is a process which probably will. There's something has started. I as I said, you know, I remember in the 80s, 90s, it wasn't like that. Nobody knew about this stuff. It was impossible to in the Western Hemisphere to see a discourse like this emerge. It was really the most marginal, radical voices that would say stuff like this. Now it's so mainstream. I can't see anybody who could just defend what Israel is doing with a straight face. I mean, they can defend to a certain extent, but usually, you know, it's this has become the stigma. This has become this has become the margin. So I think there's a shift in public opinion, and there's something that's happening. People are transforming, as you know, Katie. You know, I follow also what she does online. The whole, you know, this transformative stuff going on is really important, and I think all of us are going through that. So yeah, I feel there is hope. I don't know if you've heard Ilan Pappes. I would advise anybody who wants a crash course history in Zionism, State of Israel, up until today, Palestine question, from 19th century till today, with the hope, with the, you know, hearing him in the midst of the aftermath of the 7th of October, he was asked to talk at Stanford University. He gave this amazing talk, full of love and compassion. It was amazing. You know, Israelis, you should, you know, definitely that kind of hope is there. We all have that hope, I think, in one way or another. Yeah, sorry, I spoke too much actually. Okay.
Thank you. I promised this event would not go on till 9, and I'm 15 minutes away from lying to you. So with that, I just want to thank you for your time, for giving us your time, for giving yourself the time. I want to really thank all of our speakers for giving us their time and so much insight. I feel like I've learned so much. And let's please just keep these conversations going and keep that open and be able to listen and learn from each other. Thank you.
Yeah, so also thanks to Peter, who really was, was there the whole time. Thank you for everybody for coming. Thanks, Katie, for meeting. Even though online, we would have liked to have you in person, maybe one day.
Yeah.
Hajar, thank you so much also, so yeah. It was good. No? بدك تحكي معه؟
This is the. I don't know. Thank you, though.
It was so lovely to meet you and to learn from you. I so appreciate it.
Yeah, it was lovely. It was great. Thanks for getting us all together.
Of course, yeah. Thank you, Katie. Things are going to get a bit chaotic now, I think. Let's keep in touch via email with everyone. I'll put you all in contact as well.
Yeah, I would love that. Thank you all so much.
Thank you, Katie. Take care.
Take care. Bye.